Thanks, Lizanne, and thanks to all of you for having me. I was worried what you were going to reveal from our dinner conversation, but I was pleased that there was nothing. Thanks for having me. I am the global business columnist at the Financial Times, and my job, my mandate really, is to look at the biggest business trends, biggest economic trends in the world and write about them in commentary form. So I've been spending a lot of my time in the last 2 years writing about digital disruption and human capital, and how to square those two things, and where those two things are going, and what the interplay is going to be. But before I take you to my thoughts about what that future is, I actually want to take you back to the past for a moment, because I always love to look at historical analogies to sort of get a sense of where I am today and what the past experiences have been. So I want to tell you about a speech that was done by John Maynard Keynes, who's a very famous British economist that I'm sure you all know. In late 1920s, he actually published a book around this speech in 1930, and it was entitled Prospects for Our Grandchildren. And it was written at a time that was very similar to the time that we're living through now. It was a period of great disruption. We'd had a market crash, recession leading to the Great Depression, all kinds of geopolitical strife, growing inequality. The Industrial Revolution was creating huge disruption technologically, so a lot of anxieties, very nervous populations. But Keynes had an optimistic view, and he wanted to tell the world about what technology was going to do for our livelihoods in the future. And so he made two predictions. And one of them was to predict what the size of the economy would be around the year 2000. And the other prediction was what the future of work was going to be, and who would be doing what, how long we would be working. And it's really interesting because he got the first prediction almost exactly right. If you look at the growth line that he predicted and where we are now, you could overlay them. It's really quite stunning. But the second prediction he got completely wrong. So Keynes thought that the wealthier we became and the more the robots were doing jobs and helping us, and software, he wouldn't have put it that way, but software and the digital technologies that we now have were coming online, that the more of those there were, that the less work we would do. So the richest people would be doing the least work, and maybe they'd be doing like 4 hours a week or something like that, and maybe really, really downtrodden folks would be doing 20 hours a week. So this was really radical at a time when, as Nick pointed out, people were working 70 hours a week in really dirty factories. But he got this exactly wrong. So as we all know, there are plenty of jobs and plenty of work for PhDs. And there's a lot of work for people that are making $15 an hour, many of whom have to have 2 or 3 jobs just to make a living wage. So very bifurcated, but there's not enough in the middle. So those middle market jobs, those sort of 50 to 100,000 K jobs that people come out of school and grow into, that bulk of the work is what's really being disintermediated now by technology. And one of the really interesting trends here is how much technological disruption benefits superstars. So if you look out into the economy right now, a few number of individuals, a few number of companies, and even, you could argue, fewer countries are taking a larger percentage of the wealth share than in the past. So you have the superstar economy, and you can take this down to the worker level. So just to talk about the gig economy for a moment, I actually think of myself in some ways as a gig worker. So I have a column and a day job as a journalist at the Financial Times, but I also work as an analyst on television. I write books, I give speeches, I do radio. I'm kind of a mini entrepreneur. And I can use lots of different technologies, virtual assistants, all kinds of social media software platforms to amplify myself. And so in the midst of a real serious structural decline in my industry, I would say that my prospects are better than they've ever been. But if you look at the gig economy at the other end of the scale and you see how technology is affecting, say, not just an Uber driver, you could make an argument pro or con there, but let's say a service worker at Starbucks whose schedule is being disintermediated on a daily basis depending on the surge of demand at a store that might leave him or her unable to meet family demands. Very, very different picture. And you can take that analogy basically across many different industries and see that we are living in this superstar economy. And that, again, by the way, is not new. There's an economist, Sherwin Rosen, who predicted in 1981 that we would have a superstar economy. And this would always be the case when new technologies were filtering through. So we've seen in the last 10 years, certainly in my country, in your country, in many parts of Western Europe, and actually much of the world, we've seen the economic impact of this bifurcation, and we've seen the political impact. But I would argue that we are actually just at the beginning of this, not only because we are moving out of the realm of the commercial internet into the Internet of Things. All the disruptions we've seen in the commercial sphere are going to be spreading out across industries, but also the fact that these new technologies are coming online and a lot of people simply don't have the education to deal with them. And that's what the real differentiator here is. It's education. I'm going to throw one more piece of research at you. There was a wonderful study done at Harvard in the 1970s looking at the impact, the economic impact of technology. And basically what this study found was that as long as education was keeping pace with technological change, then all boats were rising. And technology would become a net job creator, the pie would grow. But the minute that education fell behind technology, that's when you started to get the problems that we're seeing in all of our economies right now: bifurcation, growing inequality, populism. And sadly, in my country, and again, in many Western European countries, education has fallen behind technology. And I think that the global professional classes are about to be blindsided by this. The blue-collar workers have already felt it. Some lower-level service workers have felt it. But all of us, I think, are going to be really feeling this crunch. And Nick pointed to a couple of examples, but let me give you one very telling and, I think, interesting example of an experiment that was done recently at Columbia University, a contest, really. Some academics at Columbia invited some of the city's, New York City's top legal minds to come in and compete against AI software that had been programmed to look at legal documents. So the robots, as you will, and the lawyers were each given a stack of non-disclosure agreements and asked to go through them and find the mistakes and see what they could do with the documents. And the results were as follows. The AI caught 95% of the mistakes. The humans caught 85% of the mistakes, which, on the face of it, you think, all right, we're a little behind the robots, but I'd still rather deal with a human lawyer. But then you look at how long the two groups took to complete the task. So the humans took 90 minutes to read through and mark up the documents. The AI took 22 seconds. So, if you think your job can't be disintermediated, think again. And I'm remembering as I was flying over to Spain yesterday that I saw a piece in the Wall Street Journal in the companies section talking about bosses, CEOs being disintermediated. So we're all at risk here. So basically, this is a problem that has to be solved. The good news is, and again, I'm going to pick up on some things that have already been said by other speakers, I think that there is a possibility to actually make work a lot more interesting. And I'll give you an example. I spoke recently to the head of the Cleveland Clinic, which is a hospital, a famous hospital in the US. They're actually expanding in the UK in a couple of years. And he pointed out something really interesting to me. Apparently, suicide rates amongst health professionals, doctors and nurses, are really high. They're higher than average. Levels of retention are low. People burn out. It's really hard to be in healthcare these days. And I asked him why, and he said basically the profession has changed radically in the last few years. It's become very administrative. There's a lot of paperwork to be done, particularly in the US, which has a completely screwed up healthcare system, which we would need another event for me to talk fully about. You have this sort of rote work. And people can't do what they got into the profession to do, which is to touch other people, to spend time by their bedsides. And it really resonated with me because my own grandmother actually was, she was an English war bride, and she was a nurse from Manchester, and she married my grandfather, who was actually Swedish, naturalized US, GI, came back to the US. long family history there. But she worked as a nurse for many, many years, and at the end of her career, she retired just frustrated from all this paperwork. And I thought to myself, wow, what if you could have AI doing that part of the job? And you could have all these healthcare workers or teachers or childcare workers, think of any kind of high-touch, high-empathy, booming profession, all of which we're going to need. I mean, just think of the amount of baby boomers that are coming into the economy that want healthcare services and want high touch. That's a real win. But how do we harness that? I won't call it low-hanging fruit, but how do we harvest that fruit? Again, it goes back to education. And here, I'm going to leave you with one story that I think is really, really optimistic. I think about it all the time, and I think it will resonate with everyone in the audience. I, a few years back, spoke to an executive at IBM who had come up with what I think is really one of the most marvelous solutions, not just for business, but for society that I've seen maybe in the last 10, 20 years. He told me 15 years ago that some CEOs, C-suite folks from IBM had gotten together and had a powwow about what the biggest problems, challenges were going to be for the company, not in the next quarter, not in the next 5 years, but in the next 20, 30, 50 years. And so they had a whole retreat about this. And what they came up with was really interesting. They didn't think it was going to be trade or China or keeping up with Google or any of the problems that you might think that IBM would be facing. They thought it would be human capital and finding people to fill good jobs. And what I mean by that is those middle market jobs, those $50,000 to $100,000 jobs where this is the bread and butter of an organization. And by the way, this is the bread and butter of the economy. In countries like ours that are basically mostly consumer spending, the math stops working if you don't have a middle class that has more money in their pocket. So they were thinking about all this. And they looked out into the educational landscape, into the job pipeline, and thought, we don't see the people coming out of schools with the skills, the digital skills, but also the empathy skills, the creativity, the entrepreneurship that we need to do these jobs. So what are we going to do about it? And the answer was, they came up with their own school. And it's interesting, I've been tracking this school. There's the first one was in my a couple of neighborhoods away from me, actually, in Brooklyn, New York, where I live, in Crown Heights. But it has spread. It's now in 20 different states and 6 different countries. And there's nothing so unique about the model. It's just a fascinating interconnection between job creators and educators. So they had IBM execs and now other companies, Microsoft's in, Google's in, 500 companies working on this project together. They had them go into the schools and look at the curriculum and say, does this match what I need to guarantee somebody a $50,000 a year job when they come out of school? And if it doesn't, let's fix it. And so that's what they've done. And what's really interesting is it is not a trade-off between STEM and liberal arts. You know, it's not a trade-off between are we having enough engineers or are we sending people to expensive 4-year colleges so they can learn about Shakespeare. It's a combination of those things. There's not a silver bullet. These kids go in to a high school, they come out not just with a high school degree, but with a 2-year degree. They're guaranteed jobs at the partner firms, or they can take those skill sets that they've learned, which include workplace learning. So a lot of what's being taught is being done in the context of pretend companies, you know, going in and presenting yourself, convincing someone about your idea, learning how to communicate. And they can come out and take that anywhere. So it's about investing in human capital that can cope with the kind of disruption that's coming. And I myself find that to be a very hopeful thing, and I think it brings together a lot of what you all are looking at, both in terms of opportunities and challenges. So I'll stop there and turn it over to our next speaker. Thanks.